Hi everyone, this is Josh Osowski again. Tonight we're going to be talking about the lectures for the readings for week 1 of PPM 300, Managing for Improved Performance. And tonight we have basically 4 different articles that I'm going to go over. I'm going to kind of say some of the salient points and some of the takeaways and stuff that I think are important from these articles. Now the first article we're going to go into is an article called Mastering Public Productivity and Performance Improvement from a Productive Management Perspective, and this is by Holzer and Lee. And in this article, Holzer and Lee, they really are focusing on 2 key aspects. The first is understanding productivity and performance in the public sector. And the second is then, once we understand that, how can we then focus more on the intangible factors, productivity improvement through people. So we're really going to be looking at more of kind of the people side of things, how a manager and their personality can really change things. But first, let's look at the first aspect, understanding productivity and performance in the public sector. And as we read the article, we see one of the first questions really is, why this emphasis on performance? I don't think this was always the case in government, but now there's really 2 reasons why there is this big emphasis on performance. The first effect is the fact that there's limited resources. There's only so much money, so much staff, so much time to be able to do things. So certain goals have to be selected. The second, why this emphasis on performance, is a high demand for services. So the public wants a lot of services. And so this is definitely a rub. We have limited resources. We have people that want more services. So what performance is really trying to do, in a way, is how can we do more with less? Though we often use this statement, and we all kind of know that it's perhaps not true, nonetheless, if we do become more efficient, we can do more, and so the goal here is to be able to do as much with as little as we have. Performance, though, they go on to say, is a difficult thing to attain, especially in the public service. If we look at kind of business models and see what their performance goals are, though there are many goals in business, the major one is always profit. However, when we look at government, it's not quite that simple. Profit, in most aspects, really isn't even a measure. And so the goals in government become more complex. We have to meet the goals of a diverse amount of people who want different things. And so this really becomes much more complex. In business, perhaps, if you think about it, there's a CEO. He sets the mission, sets the tone of the business. But if we look at who's in charge of government, it becomes much more complex. Is it really the president? Is it the governor? Is it a local administrator? Or is it the people who elect the legislators? Is it the legislators themselves? And really, if we are looking at a kind of democratic principle, really kind of government is everyone's, and we all have an equal say. So as a result, these goals becomes much more complex. And it's difficult to find the right measures then when we have a variety of goals with often sometimes even differing outcomes, perhaps even conflicting outcomes. We're going to talk about conflicting outcomes more in some of the later lectures, later articles tonight. So one of the things that often is then trying to kind of sort of government's supposed to emulate is business. And so we hear concepts like business-like government. And one of the fallacies here is that we can, as a government, become like business because of these very diverse goals of government and the responsibilities to whom. But Holzer and Lee go on to talk about a kind of a generic recipe that we as managers in government can use to try to be able to implement improvement actions for performance. So in the article, those are on pages 4 to 5. I'm not going to go over them in a lot of detail because I think it's pretty clear there, but I would suggest you really look at these and see, as we start working on our project and you trying to find out what problem you're going to try to improve performance in your own workplace, take a look at these 10 steps, because I think they're good tools to help you analyze what is the problem and what can you do to try to figure out good fixes. Look at, really analyze it in a really thorough way. So take some time and really look at that. The second part of their article is focusing on the intangible factors, productivity improvement through people. And this part of the article I really enjoyed because it really starts highlighting the skills that a manager brings to improving performance. And I think sometimes this gets overlooked. We think that employees don't work hard enough, or employees aren't doing the right thing. And I think that often the emphasis should be placed more on the manager. The manager does set the tone. And so they recommend some personal things, personal development things that managers can do. So there's things such as they talk about transformational leadership. That's really kind of the way that managers transform the culture, so to speak, or set an agency into a new direction. Another one of their key aspects that they talk about is employee motivation. And this is one of the most important skills as a manager. How do you motivate people to do things that they don't want to do? So they talk about that. Next, building trust. We think often that, or maybe I should say, we overlook trust as a key thing. I know in my own personal experience working with people, if they don't trust you, they're not going to follow you. They're not going to believe in you. One of the things I've always tried to do with my staff is one, show a lot of heart and show that I care about what we do and believe in the core mission. But two, is I really wanted them to know that I got their back, that they can trust me. And I let them know on a regular occasion that we all make small mistakes from time to time, and if a mistake is made in a small way, I'm going to have your back. We'll figure out how to get through the situation. The thing I don't tolerate, though, is people who purposely stirring the pot or causing trouble or purposely causing infights. That's something I don't have any tolerance for, and I let people know that also. And then through your actions, when people do certain things correctly, you reinforce that. And when they maybe step out of line, you also correct that. People over time will begin to trust you. And once they trust you, I think a lot of the fights go away. When you ask them to do something differently, they don't think you have a hidden agenda where you're going to try to get them or something like that. So trust, I really do see is just such an important thing. Next, they talk about disseminating a clear vision and eliminating obstacles. So, really setting a clear goal about what it is that we're going to do now to improve performance. And then, being open and really paying attention to the obstacles that are going to be there. Listening to the staff, trying to think ahead of time what some of these obstacles are going to be, and trying to then eliminate them for them. And then lastly, they talk about understanding employee commitment. So I think these are some real important things. I love these intangible factors. I think we should spend more time focusing on that and developing these skills as managers so that we can be more productive. In the next article, Contract Management Capacity in Municipal and County Governments by Brown and Petoskey. Whereas before we were looking at efficiency with government employees and agencies overall, in this one we're going to look at a specific aspect of service, specifically when government hires private companies to perform the services. And really the question that they want to look at is how do we manage these things properly? Now, looking back at the literature review in this article, Petoskey and Brown, they begin with looking at, well, what are the pros and cons of contract management? It's a very controversial point of view in public administration. Some people believe that private interests aren't good, and others believe that they are good when it comes to providing service. So some of the pros of having a private contractor that are cited in the literature will reflect things such as reduced costs. So they believe that private companies can provide services cheaper than government employees. Also, they believe that the private contractor has improved flexibility. Often this comes from the fact that private companies don't have to necessarily have the same regulations that might burden a government agency, and often they don't have to hire union workers. So as a result, they can get them cheaper, and maybe their workers don't have the same rights that a unionized workforce would. Also, there's things cited that customer satisfaction becomes increased when private companies perform the services. Now, on an opposite point of view, there are people who will say that, and much of the literature will also state this, that private service doesn't work. They might cite many of the failed contracts that over the years they write these contracts with private companies, and it just doesn't work out. Also, another often cited thing is that really the core mission, private companies' emphasis is in profits. So do the underprivileged and the underserved become harmed when the whole motive is just to save money? So that's one of the cons. And thirdly, and this is really what the whole point of this article is about, is when government does not properly manage a contract. So the rest of this article is going to look at that aspect. What are kind of the signs that a government is doing it correctly, is properly managing a private contractor. And they begin talking about, okay, well, if we're going to find out whether we're doing a good job of overseeing these private contracts, what are really some of the key aspects of a government agency that they need to have in order to be able to properly manage a private contract. So they come up with three concepts, three capacities that are necessary to be able to do this. And I should note that part of the problem with this too is that they're very complex. So we're going to see that these three things each require a different set of skills. So the typical administrator may or may not have all of these skills, which will also impact whether a private service is managed properly. So the first is feasibility assessment capacity. And what we're talking about here is, does the government official have vendors, are there vendors that actually exist that can perform the work? So being able to figure out, is that possible? And also figuring out what aspects of government are appropriate to contract out. For instance, though many cities and municipalities are more than happy to have private companies come and take care of the garbage services, picking up garbage from households and businesses, they're going to be less likely to turn over their police function to a private function. Even though that has happened, we tend to see that there's certain areas where managers will think, well, maybe this is okay to let private companies take care of, but this other stuff, there's just too much public trust involved, so we can't allow a private company to take over that. The next capacity is what we call implementation capacity. And here we're looking to see if a government has basically the skills to be able to negotiate, structure a contract, and has the skills to be able to bid and then finally select a vendor who's going to perform a good job. So that's the second one, implementation capacity. And then finally we're looking at evaluation capacity. And so here at this stage we've selected a company to be able to do the private services. But now we need to monitor and evaluate their work, make sure they're doing a good job through that process. And so some cities have these 3 skills and others don't. But Brown and Petoskey then go on to ask the question, but do governments make the investments to increase capacity so that they can properly manage the contracts? So the big question in this paper is okay, we see that there are 3 capacities that are needed to be able to manage a private contract, but do governments invest in their employees and with their time and with their money to be able to build the capacity so that they can properly manage these private contracts? And in their research, what they come up with is that they are cautiously optimistic that government is adjusting and increasing capacity. And so their implication is that private contractors are being satisfactorily managed by government officials. So they have a fairly optimistic point of view that yes, over time, governments will build capacity to be able to better manage these private contractors. So in general, what their conclusion is that this is an okay thing for government to do. So I think they would argue that since government does build capacity, that they are essentially in favor of privatizing certain aspects of government. In the third article, entitled "In Defense of Bureaucracy, Public Managerial Capacity, Slack, and the Dampening of Environmental Shocks" by O'Toole and Meyer, we're dealing with capacity, but specifically managerial capacity. And when we're talking about managerial capacity in this aspect, we're looking at the amount of work that can be done but isn't. A term we also can call this slack. And usually slack is considered a bad thing because slack means that work isn't getting done. It's potential that's not being used. But O'Toole and Meyer see this as perhaps a good thing. At least a certain amount of it could be a good thing. And the reason for that is because occasionally agencies go through difficult times economically. There might be big budget cuts that could drastically impact a program. But what happens when this happens, and this is what they're studying, is that instead of the budget cuts, perhaps like they're going to be looking at schools in this article, instead of it resulting in teachers being laid off, perhaps management can cut other programs. So they can keep the same amount of teachers, and perhaps some of the work that would have been done by other people gets picked up by the managers, and so the organization continues to move on through these difficult times with less of an impact. This is important, they say, because for managers, one of their core responsibilities is to protect the public organization from disruption. What they see is organizations that are more stable tend to flourish better, tend to perform better. And because we all know that times change, the environment changes, occasionally organizations are going to go through these difficult times. So the question that O'Toole and Meyer are asking is some of this slack a good thing because it provides some shock absorption to these big impacts? So in order to test their hypothesis, they look at the staffing levels of central offices in schools in Texas. They also look at budget cuts. So they're looking for schools that have had a large budget cut. And then they're also looking at attendance in schools as sort of the performance factor. So what they're looking at is, does the amount of people working in the central office, when there's a budget cut, does that affect student attendance? So the implication would be is if a budget gets cut, then they don't have the staff to provide the programs, perhaps after school programs and so forth. They're going to help kids keep going to school. So this is basically kind of the question they're looking at and studying. And what they found is that, at least in the short run, this slack is useful. That it seems that the numbers don't really go down. That the kids keep attending school in the same quantities, same attendance levels. But this can only happen for a short one. Over the long term, without budgets being restored to certain levels, then things do go down. And so some of the big takeaways from this article include, off the word bureaucracy. Often we think of this as a sort of a dirty word. When we hear the news media talk about bureaucracy or people that we know, it's a bad thing. It's talking about, it's often associated with waste and low performance. But what O'Toole and Meyer say is that a little bureaucracy might be a good thing, especially in times of economic disturbances. They also say that using the slack during difficult budget times is a defensive move and cannot be turned into a positive outcome for the organization in the long run. So in the short run, the slack can sort of overcome some of the difficulties of a big budget cut, but in the long run, it's not going to make the organization a more positive or better run organization. And the third takeaway, I think, is though some slack is good for challenging times, when does it become too much? So as a manager, we might think about having a certain amount of slack at our higher levels of organization, in our head offices, in order to be able to deal with difficult times, emergencies, and so forth. But when does having too much slack result in basically missing opportunities? So instead of having someone working in the front line helping kids or whatever the issue is, instead we have them in an office just in case they're needed for an emergency. When does too much slack become a bad thing? And I think that's an interesting question. I think the fact that we're looking at slack as possibly a good thing to a certain degree is an interesting thought and something to think about. But conversely, having too much of it, of course, would be a bad thing. So they don't overstate its importance. In the final article, Reinventing Reforms, How to Improve Program Management Using Performance Measures, really, by Kasdan, takes a look at trying to find a good way to make performance measurement programs work in government. Kasdan looks at the Government Performance and Result Act, also known as the GPRA, and its goal was to improve performance and results in government. However, it's largely failed. And so Kasdan says the reason for this is basically twofold. The first has to do with the fact that multiple purposes were expected from the measures. What this means is that there's sort of like multiple goals set up for the measures that became in conflict. And one example they used in the article was that not only were the measures meant for managers to be able to kind of show off the good things they were doing and also allow them to see what was wrong and improve upon it, but there was sort of a conflicting goal where the legislative office was to use these same measures and reward and punish, often punish if things weren't met properly. So these kind of conflicting goals, and there were more than just these two, resulted in it being complicated and not used effectively. People weren't sure really what was the real purpose behind it. So these conflicts and lack of clarity resulted in poor measures and poor reporting. The second, and probably the most important for the purpose of this article and their argument, was that the performance measures were not linked to any direct incentives, be that good or bad. So if performance was good, they would be rewarded, or if performance was bad, they would be punished. And ultimately, this caused a lot of problems because managers quickly realized that there was no consequences to really doing a good or bad job according to the measures. What mattered was, as far as budgets go, is if the public was behind you or was vocal, your budget would do well, and if if the public wasn't vocal about it, your budget wouldn't do as well. So they realized very quickly that it still was politics more so than performance. After determining the two reasons why GPRA didn't work, Kasdan then goes on to basically find ways of fixing these sort of programs for the future, and comes up with some recommendations and issues or problems to consider when creating new policies or new measurement programs so that they can be effective and actually result in improved performance. So the first of these was something called measurement, noise, and reliability. And here, really what this has a lot to do with is coming up with good goals, or I should say good performance measures that can be accurately measured. One of the problems they found was that in certain cases, the manager might be doing a really good job, but because of an environmental factor, their performance would go down. So let's say, for example, their job was to effectively, like a forest service, something effectively to cut down trees and get rid of trees. However, this year a hurricane came through, knocked down all kinds of trees, and made their budget for cutting down trees go out of whack. So there, the environment had such a big role. It had little to do with the manager's approach or ability to effectively perform. But as a result of the conflict of the hurricane, you get noisy measurements. So being aware of manager performance and taking into account also environmental factors that may cause that to skew those results. The second thing was that was cited as importance was the role of incentives. And basically Kasdan talks about two different types of incentives. There are program incentives or rewards, and there are personal rewards. In the program rewards, what we're looking at here is if you do well, the budget for your program is going to continue as it was or shall be increased if you reach certain goals. So that would be a reward for doing a good job. Other types of incentives are personal rewards. So managers, if they reach a certain benchmark, will receive a personal reward in money or something like that. And so the thought is that that will increase performance. Next, Kasdan looks at the problems of multiple program goals. And so here is another one of the problems with performance measures. You need to come up with the correct measures. And sometimes, with a lot of our agencies, we have conflicting goals that actually sort of undo the other. One example used in the article talks about the U.S. Forestry Service, where they have one task to harvest timber, and the second task is to improve the environment. So a lot of people would argue that building roads through forest is going to degrade water quality, is going to affect the wildlife, and so that's in direct contrast with improving the environment. So often these kind of things take place, and they need to be correctly analyzed if we're going to really see is an agency performing in its mission. The next thing talks about the problem of multiple incentives. And so here, let's say we come up with the right measures and we incentivize them. But what will happen over time is that certain incentives will be sought after more than others because there's going to be bigger rewards. So for, let's say, for example, they do task A, they get X amount of money. But if they do task B, they get X plus Y amount of money for doing that. So what's going to happen is managers are naturally going to go for what's going to get them the most money. And so these other missions, though still important, will become minimalized, and performance will not increase as much as it should because there's just not as much of a reward. So it's very important that when incentives are giving for multiple things, that they're giving in the right places. Next, Kasdan talks about after all of these things are set up, we come up with good measures. They're accurate. We're able to deduce the right amount of performance to see if agencies are doing well or not. We then need to look at something to make sure that it's worth doing. So, for instance, if it costs so much money and takes so much time to be able to measure the performance, is it worth doing? So there may be a point in time where government officials then have to decide that no, it's not. It just costs too much money. It's too much red tape. It's just not worth it. So they go ahead and decide not to do it. They consider not to do it. But the big takeaway from this article is that though there has been much problems in many of the performance measurement systems, and that there's a lack of evidence that they are actually increasing performance at all, we shouldn't be blaming the performance systems. The big takeaway here is that Kasdan argues the reason why these systems aren't working is because they're not properly incentivized. So instead of rewarding or punishing bad or good performance, managers know that if they go political, if they get the public to outcry, that their programs aren't going to have money taken away from them. So we really need to make rewards based on performance if we're going to see real change take place. So that's it for the lecture for the 4 readings. Please read all of the readings and start working on your paper that's due on next Sunday, and also start working on your discussion. It's all posted on Blackboard. And if you have any questions, please contact me. So good luck and do well. Thanks.